But bedrock doesn't crack under impact. Bedrock doesn't show a smooth, curved edge when you brush the dirt away. And bedrock definitely doesn't send ice through your veins the moment you realize you're staring at the top of a human skull. Eustace had been clearing land for a new timber framing workshop on the eastern side of Turtle Island, an area he'd walked past countless times during 30 years of ownership but had never developed. The ground here was rough, steeply sloped, and thick with underbrush that suggested no one had disturbed it in generations. Still, the spot was ideal, close enough to the main compound for easy access, yet far enough away to preserve the wild character that defined his mountain retreat. That morning he was working alone, savoring the quiet that came with early labor, the kind of physical work that let his mind settle into the land's own rhythm. The task was straightforward: clear brush, remove topsoil, level the foundation area. Simple. Predictable. Peaceful. Until the shovel hit bone, Eustace froze, staring at what he'd uncovered. His first instinct was to hope he was mistaken, that this was an animal burial, maybe a deer or bear that had died and been covered by decades of soil buildup. But even as the hope formed, he knew it wasn't true. The shape was unmistakable. The size was unmistakable. And the placement, deliberately flat, carefully positioned, suggested intention, not accident. That he set the shovel down with hands that had begun to tremble, not from fear, but from the sudden, crushing weight of implications. Human remains on Turtle Island. Buried without markers, without records, without any hint in 30 years of ownership that this land held graves. Eustace pulled out his phone. Service was spotty this deep in the mountains, but he managed to reach the Watauga County Sheriff's Office. The call was short and surreal. "This is Eustace Conway at Turtle Island. I need to report a discovery. Human remains on my property." The dispatcher's tone changed instantly from routine to urgent. "Are you in danger, sir? Is this an active crime scene?" "No. Nothing like that. The remains are old, very old, based on depth and condition. But they're definitely human. Don't disturb anything further. We're sending deputies and a forensic team." "How long until we can reach your location?" 45 minutes if they know the roads. An hour if they don't." Eustace ended the call and sat on a nearby log, staring at the partial skull still half buried in earth. 30 years he had owned this land. 30 years of walking these trails, teaching primitive living skills, hosting workshops, building structures. 30 years of believing he knew every acre, every stone, every story this mountain held, and now this evidence that Turtle Island's history ran deeper, and darker, than any deed or survey could show. The forensic team. They arrived 90 minutes later, led by Dr. Sarah Hendricks, the state's consulting forensic anthropologist. She approached the site with the careful precision of someone who had done this work far too many times. Her expression stayed neutral, but her eyes were sharp. She knelt beside the exposed skull, studying it without touching, taking photographs from every angle. After several minutes of silent examination, she looked up at Eustace. "This burial is old. Based on soil compaction and root intrusion patterns, I'd estimate at least 100 years, possibly more. But Mr. Conway, there's something you need to understand." She stood. "This isn't a natural burial. The position, the depth, the complete absence of grave goods or markers, this suggests concealment rather than commemoration." "Meaning what?" "Meaning someone wanted this person hidden, not honored. And in my experience, people hide bodies for reasons that aren't peaceful." Dr. Hendricks scanned the surrounding area with the methodical gaze of someone reading landscape like a document. "Mr. Conway, I need to expand the search perimeter. If this is what I suspect, there may be more. More bodies? More secrets? The documents in the wall to understand how Eustace ended up standing over a century-old grave that raised more questions than answers, go back 3 months, to a discovery he made while renovating the oldest cabin on Turtle Island, a structure that predated his ownership by at least 80 years. The cabin had been in rough shape when Eustace bought the property in the early 1990s, and he had always planned to restore it properly. But other projects took priority, and the old building had sat mostly forgotten, used occasionally for storage, but otherwise untouched. This spring he finally committed to the renovation, beginning with structural assessment and timber replacement. While removing damaged wall boards on the north side, he noticed something odd. A section of the interior wall, hidden behind decades-old paneling, didn't match the rest of the construction. The timber was different. The joinery was cruder. There was a gap between logs that shouldn't exist in competent frontier building. Curiosity overrode caution. Eustace pried away the suspicious section. Behind it, wedged into a deliberately created cavity, was a metal box roughly the size of a large book. The box was old, its surface oxidized and pitted, sealed with what appeared to be tar or pitch that had hardened over decades into something almost stone-like. Breaking the seal required tools and patience. When he finally opened the container, Eustace found himself staring at documents that shouldn't have survived a century in mountain humidity. The papers were brittle and discolored, but remarkably preserved by the box's seal and the dry cavity that had protected them. The first document was a letter dated October 14, 1897, written in elegant script that belonged to an educated hand. Brother, I write this in fear for my life and in hope that truth will survive even if I do not. The Hargrove family continues to press their false claim to our land, and their methods have grown from legal harassment to open threats. 2 of our cattle were found slaughtered last week, and yesterday someone fired a rifle shot through our cabin window while Mary and the children slept. The sheriff refuses to act, claiming insufficient evidence, though everyone in the valley knows the Hargroves are behind this campaign of terror. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing a land dispute that had escalated from civil disagreement to something far more sinister. The writer, a man named Thomas Bradshaw, described meetings with county officials who dismissed his complaints, neighbors who refused to testify out of fear, and a growing certainty that powerful interests were conspiring to drive his family from property they had legally homesteaded. The final paragraph made Eustace's skin crawl. If you receive this letter without having heard from me directly, assume the worst has befallen us. I have hidden copies of our deed and survey in 3 locations on the property, marked in ways only you would understand. Do not let our claim die with us. Do not let the Hargroves profit from murder. But there were more documents in the box. A second letter, dated 3 weeks later, in different handwriting. Sheriff Watson, I am writing to report the disappearance of my brother Thomas Bradshaw, his wife Mary, and their 3 children. They have not been seen since the night of November 7th. Their cabin shows signs of hurried departure, but neighbors report hearing gunshots and screaming from that direction on the evening in question. I demand a full investigation, particularly of the Hargrove family, who have been threatening my brother for months over disputed land boundaries. And then, most chillingly, a 3rd document, not a letter, but a newspaper clipping from November 1897, yellowed and fragile. Homestead family missing. Authorities report that the Bradshaw family, recent settlers in the Western Valley region, appear to have abandoned their claim under cover of night. Sheriff Watson states that while the circumstances are unusual, there is no evidence of foul play. The family's unclaimed homestead reverts to county jurisdiction pending resolution of competing land claims filed by the prominent Hargrove family of Boone. Eustace had sat in that old cabin for over an hour, reading and rereading the documents, trying to reconcile what they implied with the peaceful mountain landscape he'd called home for 3 decades. The Bradshaw family hadn't abandoned their claim. They had disappeared under circumstances the writer clearly believed involved murder, and their land, the land they died trying to keep, had somehow ended up in the hands of the very family they accused. In the weeks that followed, he traced property records through the county courthouse. The chain of title was murky, complicated by missing documents and suspiciously convenient fires that destroyed certain records in 1903 and again in 1928. But eventually the land had been subdivided, sold, resold, and finally consolidated into the parcel Eustace purchased decades later. Turtle Island, his sanctuary, his life's work, sat on ground that might have been stolen through violence and buried through conspiracy, and now, standing over a grave positioned almost exactly where the Bradshaw cabin would have stood according to the old survey maps he'd found, Eustace understood with chilling certainty whose bones he had just uncovered. The town that remembers news of the discovery spread through the mountain communities faster than Eustace expected. By the second day of the forensic investigation, reporters were calling. By the third day, they were showing up at Turtle Island's gate, cameras ready, questions prepared about a mass grave and mountain massacre before anyone had confirmed what had actually been found. But the media attention, unwelcome as it was, brought something unexpected. People started coming forward, elderly residents from Boone Valley, Crusoe, and surrounding hollows. People who had heard stories from grandparents and great-grandparents, stories about what really happened on the land that became Turtle Island. The first was Eleanor Pritchard, 92 years old, who arrived in her grandson's truck and insisted on speaking with Eustace directly. He met her at the gate, away from the forensic team and growing media presence. "My grandmother knew the Bradshaws," Eleanor began without preamble, her voice strong despite her age. "She was just a girl when they disappeared, but she remembered them. Remembered Mary Bradshaw teaching Sunday school. Remembered Thomas as a kind man who helped neighboring families with barn raisings and harvest work." "What happened to them?" Eustace asked quietly, what everyone suspected but nobody would say out loud. "The Hargroves wanted that land. They tried claiming it through legal channels and failed, so they took it another way." Eleanor's eyes were hard with old anger. "My grandmother said she heard the gunshots that night. Everyone in the valley heard them. And the next morning, the Bradshaw cabin was burned to the ground. The family was gone. And the Hargroves were telling anyone who'd listen that the Bradshaws had just abandoned their claim out of fear. Why didn't anyone go to the authorities?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "The authorities were the Hargroves. Sheriff Watson was married to a Hargrove cousin. The county judge was on the Hargrove payroll. The newspaper editor owed them money. You didn't cross that family, not if you wanted to keep farming in these mountains." Over the following days, more stories emerged. A retired teacher brought family journals mentioning the Bradshaw tragedy and hinting at witnesses threatened into silence. A local historian shared newspaper articles from neighboring counties that covered the disappearance more critically than the Boone paper, questioning the official narrative and suggesting foul play. Most disturbingly, an 87-year-old man named Curtis Wilcox came forward with a story his grandfather had shared on his deathbed. "Grandpa was part of the crew that helped clear that land after the Bradshaws disappeared," Curtis explained, voice shaking. "He said they were told to burn everything to make sure no evidence remained of what happened. And he said, he swore to me before he died, that he'd seen blood. Lots of blood, more than could be explained by some family just packing up and leaving." "Did he say where?" "In the cabin. On the floor. On the walls. And he said there were drag marks leading from the cabin toward the woods. But the Hargrove men, they threatened anyone who talked. Said they'd end up buried next to the Bradshaws if they didn't keep quiet." The full excavation began 2 weeks after Eustace's initial discovery, transforming Turtle Island from a primitive skills sanctuary into something resembling an archaeological crime scene. Yellow tape marked boundaries. White tents covered dig sites. Teams of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and law enforcement personnel moved methodically across land undisturbed for over a century, Eustace watched from a distance, feeling like a stranger on his own property. The rhythms of Turtle Island had been completely disrupted. No workshops. No students. No demonstrations of frontier living. Just the careful, meticulous work of uncovering what people had fought so hard to hide. Dr. Hendricks ran the operation with military precision, designating each potential burial site with alphanumeric codes and establishing protocols for documentation that would hold up in court if the investigation ever led to prosecutions, though who could be prosecuted for murders committed over 100 years ago by people long dead remained an open question. The first complete excavation was Site Alpha 1, the original grave Eustace discovered. It took 3 days of careful work to fully expose and document the remains. When Dr. Hendricks finally briefed Eustace on the findings, her expression was grim. Adult male, approximately 35 to 40 years old at time of death. Multiple perimortem traumas, skull fracture consistent with blunt force impact, broken ribs suggesting repeated strikes. And most telling, the hands were bound. Bound? We found remnants of rope around the wrist bones. This man was restrained when he died, Mr. Conway. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Subsequent sites yielded similar horrors. Alpha 2, adult female, late 20s. Evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. Alpha 3, child, approximately 8 to 10 years old. Alpha 4, child, approximately 6 to 8 years old, each burial shallow. Each unmarked. Each positioned to avoid easy discovery. By the end of week 3, the team had excavated 5 sites. The 6th remained unopened, ground-penetrating radar suggesting it might contain multiple individuals rather than a single burial. We believe this is a mass grave, Dr. Hendricks explained during a briefing that included Eustace, the sheriff, and representatives from the state attorney general's office. The radar signature suggests at least 2 individuals, possibly 3, buried together in a larger pit than the others. The children? Eustace asked, though he already knew, possibly. We won't know for certain until we excavate, and that's going to take time, resources, and permission from multiple agencies. Dr. Hendricks paused, but Eustace, there's something else. The initial remains you uncovered, I've completed preliminary analysis. Adult male, mid-30s at time of death. Evidence of perimortem trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force impact. Someone killed him. Violently. And buried him in an unmarked grave over a century ago. And if the pattern holds, he wasn't alone. The living descendant. She arrived at Turtle Island on a Thursday afternoon without warning, driving a rental car and carrying a leather folder that looked older than she was. Her name was Rebecca Bradshaw Collins. She introduced herself to Eustace with directness that suggested she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Bradshaw, she said. And I've been waiting my whole life for someone to finally find what happened to my family. Eustace invited her into his cabin, away from the ongoing excavation and ever-present media. Rebecca was in her late 50s, a professor of history at a university in Tennessee, and she carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone who had devoted significant energy to researching family tragedy. How did you know? Eustace asked. How did you know they were buried here? I didn't know for certain, but I knew the land. She opened her folder, revealing documents that paralleled and expanded on what Eustace had found in the cabin wall. My great-grandfather, Thomas's brother, the one who wrote that letter demanding an investigation, documented everything. Kept records. Drew maps. Interviewed anyone who would talk to him about what happened. Rebecca pulled out a hand-drawn map, remarkably detailed, showing the Bradshaw homestead and surrounding property. this is where my great-great-grandfather built his cabin. This is where the barn stood. And these," she pointed to 6 small X marks scattered around the property, "are where my great-grandfather believed the bodies were buried, based on what witnesses told him before they were silenced." Eustace compared her map to the excavation grid Dr. Hendricks had created. The locations matched almost perfectly. 6 X marks. 6 burial sites. A century-old map predicting exactly where forensic technology would later confirm unmarked graves. "Rebecca, what do you want from this?" Eustace asked quietly. "What does justice look like for murders committed over 100 years ago by people who are long dead?" "Truth," she replied immediately. "Acknowledgement. My family has lived for 4 generations knowing what happened but never being able to prove it. Never being able to give Thomas and Mary and their children proper burial. Never being able to hold anyone accountable." She paused, emotions breaking through her academic composure. "The Hargrove family is still prominent in this region, Mr. Conway. They own businesses. They serve in government. They sit on charity boards. And they've built that influence on land stolen through murder. So what are you asking me to do?" Rebecca met his eyes directly. "Let the investigation continue. Cooperate fully. And when the time comes, help me make sure the world knows exactly what the Hargrove family did and how they've profited from it for over a century. That could destroy people who had nothing to do with what their ancestors did. And my family was destroyed by what those ancestors did. Thomas's brother died without ever knowing what happened to his brother's family. His children grew up knowing their uncle had been murdered, but unable to prove it. Every generation has carried that weight, that knowledge, that injustice." Rebecca's voice was steel. "I'm not interested in protecting the descendants of murderers, Mr. Conway. I'm interested in truth." She left documents with Eustace, including genealogical research connecting the current Hargrove family to the men who owned the land in 1897. Several names were familiar, local business owners and political figures Eustace had encountered over the years without knowing their connection to Turtle Island's buried history. That night, Eustace sat with those documents spread across his table, understanding he had reached a point of no return. The investigation had moved beyond academic interest or historical curiosity. Rebecca Bradshaw Collins represented living descendants with claims not just to truth, but potentially to the land itself. Land Eustace had purchased legally, but that had been stolen through violence, and if he chose to push forward, to expose the full truth and help Rebecca hold the Hargrove family accountable, he'd be making enemies of powerful people with deep roots in these mountains. People who might have inherited more than just land and influence from their ancestors. The question was whether justice for a century-old crime was worth risking everything Eustace had built, and whether silence, even protective silence, was something he could live with. Knowing what he now knew, the reckoning, the threat started 2 days after Rebecca's visit. Nothing overt at first, just small things designed to unsettle rather than harm. Equipment moved during the night. Tools disappearing and reappearing in wrong locations. A dead coyote hung from the gate to Turtle Island with a note attached: "Some secrets should stay buried." Eustace reported everything to the sheriff, who increased patrols and assigned a deputy to stay on the property overnight. But everyone understood that whoever was behind the intimidation was sending a clear message: stop digging. Stop investigating. Stop threatening to expose what powerful families wanted kept hidden. Dr. Hendricks took the threat seriously enough to temporarily suspend fieldwork until security could be improved. The forensic team was withdrawn, leaving the final burial sites unexcavated and the investigation in suspended urgency, but the pause gave Rebecca time to work. She'd spent years preparing for this moment, and she wasn't deterred by anonymous threats or implied violence. She filed formal petitions with the county requesting access to all historical records related to the Bradshaw land claim and the Hargrove family's acquisition of the property. She contacted journalists, sharing her research and the preliminary forensic findings. She built public pressure that made silence increasingly difficult to maintain. The response was swift and predictable. Lawyers representing the current Hargrove family sent cease and desist letters, accusing Rebecca of defamation and threatening legal action if she continued publicly connecting their family to the murders. Local politicians who had previously supported historical preservation suddenly expressed concerns about the cost and disruption of continuing the investigation. Several prominent community members, people Eustace had considered friends, called to suggest that maybe it was time to let the past rest. "You've made your point," one told him. "The story's been told. The victims have been found. But dragging this out, attacking local families, destroying reputations over something that happened over 100 years ago. That's not justice. That's revenge." But Eustace had made his decision. He'd seen the children's remains, 3 small skeletons arranged as if holding each other while earth was shoveled over them. He'd read Thomas Bradshaw's letters, a man terrified for his family and proven right to be afraid. He'd met Rebecca, the living embodiment of generations denied justice and closure. Some truths, no matter how old or inconvenient, demanded to be told. He called a press conference, the first he had ever held at Turtle Island. Media from across the region attended, along with Rebecca, Dr. Hendricks, representatives from the state attorney general's office, and several members of the current Hargrove family who arrived with lawyers and expressions of practiced outrage. Eustace began simply. 30 years ago, I purchased this land believing I knew its history. I was wrong. What I've learned over the past 2 months has changed not just how I understand this property, but how I understand the responsibility that comes with owning land where terrible things happened. He detailed the discovery, the forensic findings, the historical documents, and Rebecca's family research. He read portions of Thomas Bradshaw's letters, letting the murdered man's own words indict his killers across the span of a century, and then he made his announcement: "I'm transferring ownership of the burial sites to Rebecca Bradshaw Collins and her family, recognizing their right to lay their ancestors to rest with dignity and honor. I'm also establishing a memorial on this property, ensuring that what happened here in November 1897 is never forgotten." The Hargrove family lawyers immediately objected, claiming the transfer violated property laws and demanding that Eustace cease making defamatory statements, but their objections were drowned out by something unexpected: applause from community members who had come to witness the announcement. Elderly residents like Eleanor Pritchard and Curtis Wilcox, people who had carried their grandparents' stories of injustice for decades, finally seeing those stories validated and honored. The investigation concluded over the following months. Dr. Hendricks's final report confirmed what everyone suspected: the Bradshaw family, all 7 members, including 3 children, had been murdered in November 1897 and buried in unmarked graves to conceal the crime. The current Hargrove family was never charged. How could they be for crimes committed by ancestors long dead? But the exposure had its own consequences. Several family members resigned from public positions. Businesses bearing the Hargrove name faced protests and boycotts. The historical record was finally corrected. Rebecca arranged a proper burial for her ancestors in the Watauga County Cemetery, a ceremony attended by hundreds. 7 coffins, one for each victim, finally laid to rest with dignity over 120 years after their murders. At Turtle Island, Eustace built the memorial he promised, a simple stone structure in the clearing where the Bradshaw cabin once stood, inscribed with the names of Thomas, Mary, and their 5 children. Beneath their names, a single sentence: murdered for defending what was theirs. Remembered for their courage. The discovery changed Turtle Island forever. But Eustace believed he had finally done right by the land, and by the people who died trying to keep it. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how powerful the family trying to keep them hidden. And sometimes justice takes over a century, but arrives nonetheless, carried forward by descendants who refuse to forget and landowners willing to face uncomfortable truths. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us, do you believe Eustace made the right choice by bringing the truth to light, even when it threatened everything he had built? Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful, untold chapter from the world of Turtle Island and the people who live, and die, on its land.